They told them it would be quick, 6 months maybe, carry supplies for the British Army fighting Germans in the African bush, come home, get paid. But when the war finally ended on November 11th, 1918, more than 400,000 African porters discovered the nightmare was just beginning. Disease, starvation, worthless paper money, and a colonial government that looked away. What happened to the men who carried an empire's war on their backs? Why did they die by the tens of thousands after the fighting stopped? The answer sits in unmarked graves across Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. August 4th, 1914. A world away in Europe, Britain declares war on Germany. Within weeks, British forces in East Africa mobilize against German East Africa. The terrain is brutal. No roads, few railways. Tsetse flies carrying sleeping sickness make pack animals useless in most areas. British General John Smuts needs a solution. He finds it in human beings. District Commissioner Oscar Ferris Watkins receives orders in Nairobi to organize a carrier corps. The British administration targets every able-bodied African male between 18 and 45. 3 methods emerge: volunteers, chiefs forced to meet quotas, and press-ganging anyone who cannot hide fast enough. By February 1916, the system is running. Provincial commissioners across Kenya, Uganda, Northern Rhodesia, and Nyasaland receive demands. Find men, send them to the front. Chiefs who resist face imprisonment. Chiefs who comply watch their villages empty. In Northern Rhodesia, over 1/3 of adult males disappear into carrier service for most of the war. The pattern repeats across British territories. The Belgians in Congo conscript 260,000 porters for their campaign. The Germans press 45,000 Africans into service at peak strength. By war's end, British forces alone employ between 500,000 and 750,000 African porters. Some estimates push the total above 1 million. If you value documented African military history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual using sources from Hugh Strahan's 2001 study in the British Official Military Histories, Edward Pace's 2007 comprehensive work, Tip and Run, published by Weidenfeld and Nicholson, and Karen Palaver's 2019 peer-reviewed article in the African Studies Review on Carrier Demobilization and Currency Demonetization, published by Cambridge University Press. Now back to the information. The ratio tells the story. For every British officer, 18 porters. For every Belgian officer, 18 porters. For every German officer, between 4 and 6 porters. Each soldier requires 3 porters minimum. 1 porter carries 60 pounds on average. Some loads reach 80 pounds. They march barefoot, half rations compared to European troops. No boots, no proper medical supplies. The British pay them 3 rupees per month. A Mombasa dock worker earns 30 rupees monthly during the same period. The wage is insult layered on exploitation. They carry everything: ammunition boxes, artillery pieces disassembled into parts, medical supplies, food, tents, officers, personal belongings, wounded soldiers. When a man collapses, another takes his load. When disease strikes, replacements arrive from the coast. The campaign becomes a carrier's open-arms war. The real battle is not defeating the enemy, but reaching him. German commander Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck understands this. He retreats constantly. Guerrilla tactics, Fabian warfare, destroy farms, raid plantations, ambush supply lines, force the British to chase him across an area the size of France, Germany, and England combined. The killing begins early, not from bullets, from disease. Dysentery rips through camps. Malaria strikes in waves. Pneumonia takes men in the highlands. The medical system is a joke. By October 1917, fewer than 13,000 hospital beds exist for carriers. Most beds sit too far from the front lines to reach. A porter struck by fever dies where he falls. His body goes unrecorded. No name, no grave marker. Just another African casualty in a European war. The 9th South African Infantry starts with 1,135 men in February 1916. By October, 116 remain fit for duty. Disease, not combat, hollows them out. If trained soldiers collapse at this rate, imagine the porters. They march longer, carry more, eat less, sleep on ground, die faster. October 1918. A new killer arrives: Spanish influenza. The second wave of the pandemic reaches Africa through returning soldiers docking at Mombasa, Freetown, and Cape Town. Ships packed tight with infected men. The virus spreads inland along railways, rivers, and footpaths. Demobilized porters carry it home to their villages. The timing could not be worse. Hundreds of thousands of exhausted, malnourished men flooding back into communities already stripped of food and resources by 4 years of war. Kenya's coast province documents the catastrophe. Between September 1918 and June 1919, officials record 31,908 influenza cases, 4,593 deaths in 9 months in one province alone. Across Kenya, 150,000 people die. The Taita District Assistant Commissioner writes in January 1919 that between 30 and 40% of the district population is infected. Deaths run approximately 50 per day and increasing. In Malindi, District Commissioner S.H. Jadlau reports on November the 5th, 1918, that influenza is getting no better. More deaths daily. Impossible to find porters for medical supply distribution. The porters who survived 4 years of war now died delivering medicine for the disease killing them. The pandemic hit sub-Saharan Africa with unique savagery. Unlike Europe and Asia, most of Africa experiences no mild first wave in spring 1918. The continent's first exposure is the lethal second wave in autumn 1918. No built immunity, no warning. Howard Phillips, historian at University of Cape Town, identifies the pattern. On the hardest hit, African countries share 3 characteristics. First exposure only to the virulent second wave, part of extensive transport networks, regularly traversed by large numbers of people on the move. Soldiers, sailors, migrant workers, porters. Africa suffers the highest average mortality rate of any continent. Roughly 5% of South Africa's population dies, 4% of Freetown. Sierra Leone dies in 3 weeks. 4 to 6% of Kenya's population dies in 9 months. An old man in Malawi recalls in 1973 that 1918 was the year when God was angry. The memory stamps itself on age sets, personal names, and the dating of all other events for a generation. Before the flu, after the flu, the survivors stagger home, weak, sick, traumatized. They find their villages devastated. The war pulled so many men away that farms went untended, crops failed, food supplies collapsed. The 1918 harvest in many areas never matured. Cassava, which grows faster than yams, appears suddenly in fields across Nigeria in 1919 and 1920. Historians note this rapid crop substitution as a pointer to the magnitude of the food crisis. Families choose speed over nutrition, survival over preference. British authorities face a problem. Hundreds of thousands of carriers need payment and demobilization, but there is no money. The war drained currency reserves. Indian rupees are scarce, silver coins even scarcer. The solution arrives in the form of 1 rupee paper notes. The British East Africa Protectorate issues these notes specifically and exclusively for paying carriers. The notes flood the system during demobilization in 1918 and 1919. Porters from Kenya and Uganda receive almost nothing but these paper rupees, despite widespread distrust of paper currency among African populations. The notes circulate, porters spend them, markets accept them, life continues. Then, in 1921, the British colonial government issues a bombshell. The 1 rupee notes are demonetized overnight. No warning, no compensation, no exchange for other currency. The notes become worthless paper. Karen Palaver's research in the African Studies Review documents the betrayal. At the time of demonetization, porters were losing approximately 58% of the pay they received for military service. The Indian community in Kenya protests, the Lukiko in Uganda protests. The general African population expresses widespread discontent. The British ignore them all. Why the sudden demonetization? Currency crisis? By December 1920, the value of the Indian rupee plummets against sterling. Rupees are smuggled in massive quantities from India to former German East Africa to exchange for florin notes. The British cannot regulate currency in one colony without affecting the others. Currency circulates across borders despite regulations. Officials decide simultaneous demonetization of rupees in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanganyika prevents demonetized coins from Kenya and Uganda flooding into Tanganyika. But they need an alternative first. The East African florin appears briefly. Then, in 1921, the East African shilling replaces the florin at a rate of 2 shillings per florin or rupee. For the porters, the currency swap means devastation. They worked, they suffered, they carried an empire's war, they received paper. The paper turned to ash. George Evans, who becomes the Commonwealth War Graves Commission's Deputy Director of Works in East Africa, writes in 1920 that most of the natives who have died are of a semi-savage nature. The erection of individual headstones would constitute a waste of public money. For those buried in the bush, as in the case of porters, some form of monument characteristically depicting the Indian soldier, the African askari, and porter would suffice. The monuments go up in Nairobi, Mombasa, and Dar es Salaam. No names, no individual recognition, just generic commemorations of anonymous masses. A Colonial Office official writes that the East African campaign had not become a scandal only because the people who suffered most were the carriers. And after all, who cares about native carriers? The numbers tell their own story. Hugh Struckon's 2001 estimate finds British losses in the East African campaign include 3,443 killed in action, 6,558 died of disease, and approximately 90,000 African porter deaths. Edward Pace's 2007 research records approximately 22,000 British casualties total. 11,189 died, 9% of the 126,972 troops in the campaign. By 1917, conscription of approximately 1 million Africans as carriers had depopulated many districts. Approximately 95,000 porters died, 20% of the British carrier corps in East Africa. The Belgian record shows 5,000 casualties, including 2,620 soldiers killed in action or died of disease, but it excludes 15,650 porter deaths. Portuguese casualties in Africa include 5,533 soldiers killed, 5,640 troops missing or captured, unknown but significant number wounded, and an unknown number of porter deaths. The Germans keep no records. Ludwig Böll writes in Der Weltkrieg, the German official history, that of the loss of levies, carriers, and boys, we could make no overall count due to the absence of detailed sickness records. A 1989 estimate suggests 350,000 casualties among German porters with a death rate of 1 in 7. The total African porter death toll across all sides likely exceeds 300,000. Jeffrey Hodges' 1999 study Carrier Corps, published by Nairobi University Press, estimates that by the end of the First World War, over 1 million Africans served with British forces during the East African campaign. Only 60,000 were combatant troops. The vast majority were porters in the Military Labor Bureau, later renamed Carrier Corps. No fewer than 95,000 died, around 10% of total manpower used. Almost twice as many porters died as Canadian, Australian, and Indian troops combined across all theaters. If you value this kind of documented historical research, subscribe. It's the best way to support this work. Also comment which city you're hearing this from. This uses sources from the 1914 to 1918 Online International Encyclopedia of the First World War, published by Freie Universität Berlin, and David Killingray's 1979 study, Beasts of Burden, published in the Canadian Journal of African Studies, along with Donald Savage and Forbes Monroe's 1966 research in the Journal of African History. Now back to the story. What happens to the survivors? Those who walk home find villages fundamentally altered. The young men are gone. The old men are dead from flu. The women struggle alone. Children go hungry. The social fabric tears. But something else emerges, a shift in consciousness. Bethwell Ogot, Kenyan historian, notes that the African soldier discovered the weaknesses and strengths of the European, who, up to that time, had been regarded by the majority of Africans as a superman. African warrant and non-commissioned officers instructed European volunteers in modern warfare techniques. It became evident the European did not know everything. The returning porters and soldiers spread new views of the white man. Much of the self-confidence and assertiveness Africans display in Kenya in the 1920s connects to this new knowledge. Several African political leaders in Kenya fought or served in the East African campaign. The experience shapes them. In Guinea, the return of ancient combatants heralds strikes, riots and demobilization camps, and attacks on the authority of chiefs. The war exposes European vulnerability. African askaris readily killed white men. The myth of European invincibility shatters on the battlefields of Tanganyika, Mozambique, and Rhodesia. Cultural responses emerge. The Beni dances appear around Lake Tanganyika during and after the war. African communities develop elaborate dance competitions that mimic the violence they witnessed. Dancers portray marauding soldiers, the brutal treatment of porters with the kiboko, the whip, the idiosyncratic rules of European warfare like taking prisoners instead of killing enemies. Songs recall specific traumas. One lyric remembers rape. Listen, my different loved ones. Sister. She cried on marrying in Zanzibar. Listen, men of Makanda. I first conceived because of a soldier of the 7th KR. That soldier came and deflowered me in Zanzibar. When dance competitions end, the victorious party gains the right to have sex with the women of the losing team. The dances process violence through performance. They give shape to horror. Other songs recall the battlefield itself. I shall go with them far away, bring cannons for a terrible war. Let's return to the coast. We brave soldiers. A carrier named Marius Karatu deserts after seeing bodies of comrades killed and mutilated by shelling. Another veteran compares the war to armed conflicts before European arrival. Never before had so many people died in a war. The scale of mechanized slaughter is incomprehensible. Traumatic experiences prevent many veterans from speaking about events, even decades later. For most, the war makes little sense. It is a European war for European reasons and European interests. The experience does not produce mass political uprising immediately. Richard Fogarty and David Killingray note in their research that demobilization in British and French Africa does not conform to George Moss's brutalization thesis that explains post-war violence in Europe. The state monopoly on violence is confirmed by the war, not challenged. Some fortunate veterans become policemen. They gain status, limited material advantages, attachment to established imperial power within their communities, but the seeds are planted. Anti-colonial sentiment grows. Nationalist consciousness develops. The Chilembwe Uprising of 1915 in Nyasaland shows the connection between war recruitment and resistance. John Chilembwe, a religious radical educated in the United States, becomes vocal critic of colonial abuses. He advocates for African independent Christian churches. Rumors of war between British and Germans add urgency to his activism. The Providence Industrial Mission sits near the Bruce Plantation, visible site of African land alienation and brutal labor practices. As British labor recruitment for porters intensifies in late 1914, Chilembwe incites his congregation. Many are teachers, educated, politically aware. The uprising fails. Government forces retake Mbambwe on January 26, 1915. About 40 rebels are executed. 300 imprisoned. Chilembwe dies on February 3, 1915, shot by a police patrol near the Mozambique border. But the memory persists. It becomes a watershed moment in Malawian history. The Giriama rebellion in Kenya coastal hinterland reveals similar patterns. In 1912, British officials try to force the Giriama to provide plantation labor. Giriama elders refuse. They control young men's labor. Losing that control means losing authority. Mekatilili, a charismatic woman prophet, enjoins the Giriama to resist British requests. August 1914, British colonial troops destroy a ritual center, the Kaya, in retaliation. War breaks out in Europe. British recruitment intensifies. The rape of a Giriama woman by a colonial soldier ignites armed resistance. Giriama fighters attack with bows and arrows. The King's African Rifles responds with massacres. Troops fire on all Giriama they meet, whether hostile or not. Systematically confiscate goats and burn dwellings. By 1915, the KAR forces the Giriama into a reserve. Many escape. The British impose massive fine and order 1,000 porters for carrier service. The cycle continues. These rebellions fail militarily, but they succeed culturally and psychologically. They demonstrate that Africans will resist. They expose the violence maintaining colonial rule. They create martyrs. They inspire future movements. Marjorie Perm writes in African nationalist historiography that it is difficult to overestimate the effect upon Africans, who had been largely enclosed within a bilateral relationship with their European rulers, of looking outside this enclosure and seeing themselves as part of a continent and of a world. The war forces that perspective shift. African troops travel to Europe, India, the Middle East. They interact with other colonized peoples. They recognize shared oppression. They imagine different futures. Meanwhile, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission begins its work. The commission, established in 1917, commits to commemorating the war dead equally regardless of rank. Noble intention, terrible execution. A 1920 report documents the racist logic. George Evans' assessment that native dead are semi-savage and unworthy of individual headstones becomes commission policy. African soldiers with names and units get graves and maintained cemeteries. African porters get mass memorials without names. Nakuru North Cemetery in Kenya embodies the disparity. The burial ground for World War I and two dead sits amid pristine gravel, light gray headstones in neat rows, equal in shape and size. Agaves, yellow daisies, silver gray dusty millers planted around. The epitome of dignity and respect. Walk the rows, read the names. Not a single African name appears. Historian Patrick Abungu notes the injustice. Some dead are looked after, while others are under the torches of Juakali, the informal metalworking sector. Historian George Hay of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission admits in 2025 that tens of thousands who served and died in British service are not commemorated in a way that was promised. Most are in East Africa. The memorials that do exist tell a different story. Kariakor in Nairobi, Kariakor in Voi, Kariakou in Dar es Salaam, Kariakou in Dodoma. These quarters take their names from the Carrier Corps. Presumably members of the Corps receive housing in these places after demobilization, but the historical record is thin. Jeffrey Hodges, definitive 1997 work Carriacor, republished in 1999 by Nairobi University Press, pieces together fragments. The organization of the Carrier Corps is a remarkable feat of improvisation by a small number of officials. Lieutenant Colonel Oscar Ferris Watkins and his team face constant struggle against superiors, excessive demands for carriers, and pressure to conscript more men. Watkins tries to protect the porters from worst abuses. He largely fails. The system is designed to extract maximum labor at minimum cost. African lives are expendable. The economic impact reverberates for years. Villages depleted of working-age men cannot recover quickly. Agricultural production remains depressed through the 1920s. The influenza pandemic compounds the demographic catastrophe. Birth rates drop, death rates spike. Some communities lose entire generations. The missionary station at Kabathi in Embu reports mortality of 6.5% and miscarriages among pregnant women of 75%. The Spanish influenza targets pregnant women with particular viciousness. The future dies in the womb. Food prices soar. Import prices rise overnight. In Uganda, import costs increase 50% during the war. The exclusion of German traders from Allied territories disrupts established commercial networks. In Sierra Leone, Germans accounted for 80% of import-export trade before the war. Their sudden removal creates a vacuum. British traders rush in. The groundnut trade in Gambia shifts from French to British buyers. France's share drops from dominant position in 1912 to negligible by 1916. British share rises from 4% in 1912 to 48% in 1916. The war is opportunity for economic aggrandizement disguised as military necessity. German East Africa becomes British Tanganyika under League of Nations mandate. The Mandate Charter requires that currency decisions consider African interests. These interests are ignored. The rupee crisis and currency instability lead to introduction of the East African shilling in 1921. The shilling is pegged at 1 shilling sterling, subdivided into 100 cents. For Africans holding demonetized rupee notes, the transition is theft, no compensation, no consideration, no justice. The long-term political consequences unfold slowly. African nationalism does not emerge as mass movement until after World War II, but World War I plants the seeds. Educated elites develop more critical approach to colonial masters. Less educated soldiers and porters spread skepticism about European superiority through communities. The experience of seeing white men kill each other over incomprehensible disputes while forcing Africans to carry the war's weight builds resentment. The broken promises about payment, land, and recognition after the war fuel bitterness. By the 1920s, African political consciousness is rising. By the 1950s, nationalist parties form across the continent. By the 1960s, independence movements succeed. The direct line from Carrier Corps to independence struggle is not simple causation, but connection exists. The porters who survived return home with new understanding. Europeans are not superhuman. Europeans are not invincible. Europeans are not necessarily superior. This knowledge transfers to children and grandchildren. It shapes the future. Ogoyi Ogunde's story illustrates the human cost. Ogunde belongs to a proud family in western Kenya near Lake Victoria. His father carved home for their clan from thick bush, accumulated wealth of cows and grain, created vibrant community. Ogunde is eldest son, his father's greatest pride, strong, intelligent, destined to lead the clan. Conscription officers arrive. They single out Ogunde for the war, a war the family never heard of, a war that has nothing to do with them. His father pleads, "Do not take him. Take someone else." The officers ignore him. Ogunde disappears into the Carrier Corps. He never comes home. Patrick Abungu, Ogunde's great-nephew and historian, searches for the grave. He finds nothing, no record, no headstone, no acknowledgement. Ogunde is one of 95,000, anonymous, disposable, forgotten. The namelessness is policy. The Commonwealth of War Graves Commission decisions made in 1920 are imbued by language and thinking that is racialized and imperial in its outlook. George Evans writes explicitly that individual headstones for natives would constitute waste of public money. The decision reflects broader colonial attitude. African lives matter less, African deaths matter less, African sacrifices deserve less recognition. The logic is consistent. Why care about native carriers? Modern scholarship tries to recover the stories. Melvin Page's 2021 collection Chiwaya War Voices presents Malawian oral histories of the Great War in Africa. Volume 1 and Volume 2 compile interviews conducted in the 1970s. The voices are mediated, translated from local languages, filtered through colonial and post-colonial frameworks, but they preserve something. Fulutia Nsanama remembers being told terrible lies. They said we would be rich people. We would have cars, houses, exemption from tax. When the war was over, they gave us nothing. The money received after service was very little. They did not build the houses promised. Another veteran recalls that talking about war secrets deserves death. They knew Germans were fierce people. The two sounds made by German guns, bah bah, gu versus British ta ta ta, confuse people about direction of fire. These details accumulate. They build picture of confusion, exploitation, and betrayal. Ali, a veteran of German forces, shares his story through intermediary. His words come through Bror Erme MacDonald, his employer during hunting expeditions in the 1940s. MacDonald is Scandinavian-Scottish heritage. Born in Belgian Congo, educated in France and England, served in British African military during World War II. Ali's memories of the early 1910s are spoken in Swahili in the 1940s, translated and edited by MacDonald in the early 1960s. The layers of mediation are obvious, but fragments emerge. Ali remembers the bodies killed and mutilated by shelling, the horror of industrial warfare, the scale of death unprecedented in African experience. Another song performed after the war by dancers at Lake Tanganyika recalls the terror. I shall go with them far away. Bring cannons for terrible war. The war is not glorious. It is not heroic. It is nightmare. Dr. Ludwig Deppe, German physician, works in field hospital, constantly moving behind the Schutztruppe. His writings describe the necessary evil of looting. All troops, including whites, depend directly on plunder for munitions, clothing, and food. One of his sick Askaris takes 3 hens and slits their throats. The owner complains and tries to reclaim them. The scene repeats endlessly. Survival requires theft. Theft requires violence. Violence becomes normalized. The carriers experience this violence most directly. Beaten with kiboko, forced to march until they collapse. Abandoned when sick, unburied when dead, the post-war settlement offers nothing to the survivors. European soldiers receive pensions, medical care marks and recognition. Indian soldiers receive some benefits, though less than Europeans. African soldiers in the King's African Rifles receive minimal compensation. African porters receive nearly nothing. The demonetized rupee notes are final insult. You worked, you suffered, you survived. Here is worthless paper. Now disappear. Some porters find work in the quarters bearing Carrier Corps name. Kariakor in Nairobi becomes hub for African laborers and small businesses. The name itself is corruption of Carrier Corps. The area provides housing for former porters and other African workers. But it is not reward. It is necessity. The men need somewhere to live. The colonial government needs African labor concentrated in manageable areas. The quarters serve administrative convenience disguised as benevolence. The demographic impact shapes East Africa for decades. The regions that provided most porters suffer longest. Northern Rhodesia, where over 1/3 of adult males served as carriers during the war, faces severe labor shortages through the 1920s. Agricultural production declines. Tax revenues drop. Social structures strain under the weight of missing men. The 14,000 men of Northern Rhodesian contingent are commemorated on Mbala War Memorial at entrance to town of Mbala in northern Zambia. They came from across the territory. Large contingent from Barotseland in northwestern Rhodesia. British South Africa Company Native Commissioner John Henry Venning recruits them and marches with them to East African border. Many never return. The influenza pandemic's timing is catastrophic. October 1918. Just as demobilization begins, the virus hits. Men already weakened by years of malnutrition and disease have no resistance. They die in camps, they die on the march home, they die in their villages within weeks of arriving. The pandemic spreads faster than any countermeasure. Medical facilities are overwhelmed. In Coast Province, Kenya, crude mortality rates increase 6-fold in 1918. Healthcare utilization increases 3-fold. Pandemic mortality rate hits 25.3 deaths per 1,000 people per year. The numbers are conservative. Many deaths go unrecorded. Rural areas keep no statistics. Mass graves receive no markers. By June 1919, the worst passes. The third wave of influenza is more moderate than the second. Survivors begin rebuilding, but the losses are staggering. Kenya loses approximately 150,000 people. Tanganyika loses similar numbers. Uganda suffers massive mortality. The total East African death toll from influenza alone likely exceeds 500,000. Add the porter deaths during the war. Add the civilian deaths from starvation and disease caused by war disruption. The total approaches or exceeds 1 million East African deaths directly or indirectly caused by World War I. For comparison, United Kingdom loses approximately 700,000 military dead. France loses 1.4 million. Germany loses 2 million. East Africa's losses are comparable to major European powers, despite having no stake in the conflict's origins or outcomes. The peace settlement ignores Africa. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 divides German colonies among victors. France takes Cameroon, Britain takes most of German East Africa as Tanganyika, Belgium takes Rwanda and Burundi, Portugal takes Kionga Triangle, South Africa takes German Southwest Africa. The League of Nations mandates place the territories under European administration with vague promises of eventual self-governance. No African voices participate in these decisions. No African interests receive consideration. The war fought partly on African soil to control African territory concludes with Africans having zero input on their own fate. The extraction continues. The British use former German plantations in Tanganyika. They expand sisal production. They develop coffee estates. They recruit African labor through many of the same coercive methods used during the war. The Native Followers Recruitment Ordinance of 1915, introduced as wartime contingency, is not fully repealed. The precedent of mass conscription remains available. Chiefs who collaborated with British recruitment during the war maintained their positions. Chiefs who resisted face marginalization or removal. The war entrenches collaborative chieftaincy as pillar of indirect rule. Ex-soldier settlement schemes allocate land in Kenya highlands to demobilized white soldiers. Lord Delamere and white settler lobby push for expansion of European land ownership. The Crown lands. Ordinance of 1902 had declared all land belonged to British imperial government. The post-war period sees third phase of European settlement into highlands. African land alienation accelerates. The Kikuyu, Maasai, Nandi, and other communities lose more territory. The promised compensation for wartime service never materializes for Africans. White soldiers get farms. African porters get nothing. The inequality is stark. The injustice is obvious. The silence from colonial authorities is deafening. A 1920 Colonial Office memo captures the attitude perfectly. The East African campaign had not become a scandal only because the people who suffered most were the carriers. And after all, who cares about native carriers? This sentence encapsulates colonial mentality. African suffering is acceptable. African death is unremarkable. African sacrifice is irrelevant. The carriers are beasts of burden, tools used and discarded. Their humanity is denied. Their contributions are erased. Their graves are unmarked, but memory persists. In villages across Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Malawi, and Zambia, families remember. Grandmothers tell grandchildren about men who went away and never came back. Songs preserve fragments of experience. Place names commemorate presence. The Kariakor quarters, the Kariakou districts, the Mbala Memorial. Physical spaces hold memory even when official records erase names. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission begins acknowledging this injustice in 21st century. In March 2025, Al Jazeera reports on efforts by historians like Patrick Abungu to locate and properly commemorate African war dead. The work is slow. The gaps are enormous. Tens of thousands of unmarked graves, hundreds of thousands of unrecorded names, but the effort matters. Recognition matters. Justice delayed is not justice denied if the work continues. The Spanish influenza's African toll finally receives scholarly attention. Howard Phillips, 1990 book Black October examines South African impact, published by the government printer in Pretoria. Fred Endai, Sandra Chavez, and Mark Alain Widdowson publish Impact of the 1918 influenza pandemic in coastal Kenya and tropical medicine and infectious disease in 2019. The research uses colonial archives, medical records, district reports. It reconstructs mortality rates, documents social disruption, analyzes healthcare system collapse. The work fills gaps. It makes visible what was hidden. It demands attention for what was ignored. The broader historical pattern is clear. Colonial powers mobilized millions of Africans for World War I. Over 2 million African soldiers and laborers participated directly. Hundreds of thousands died. Millions more suffered indirect consequences: famine, disease, economic collapse, social disruption. The aftermath was equally brutal. Broken promises, worthless currency, no compensation, no recognition. The demographic, social, economic, medical, cultural, psychological, religious, and spiritual impact lasted at least a generation. In territories across Africa, the memory remained stamped on age sets and personal names. 1918 and 1919 become markers: before the flu, after the flu, before the war, after the war. The political consciousness emerging from this experience shapes 20th century African history. World War II repeats many patterns. African troops fight in Ethiopia. North Africa, Burma. 2 million more Africans mobilize. They return with greater expectations, greater anger, greater organization. The Atlantic Charter of 1941 promises self-determination for all peoples. African leaders hold Europeans to that promise. The Pan-African Manchester Congress in 1945 marks turning point. African nationalism shifts from elite intellectual movement to mass mobilization. Kwame Nkrumah in Gold Coast, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, Julius Nyerere in Tanganyika, Kenneth Kaunda in northern Rhodesia. They all connect wartime service to demands for independence. They mobilize veterans. They invoke sacrifice. They demand justice. By 1957, Gold Coast becomes independent Ghana. By 1963, Kenya achieves independence. By 1964, Tanganyika and Zanzibar unite as Tanzania. Northern Rhodesia becomes Zambia. Nyasaland becomes Malawi. The colonial empires crumble. The process is not smooth. Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya involves terrible violence. Algerian War of Independence is brutal. But by 1966, most of Africa is independent. The connection to World War I is indirect but real. The porters who survived, the soldiers who fought, the civilians who endured, they passed down knowledge. Europeans are not invincible. Colonial rule is not inevitable. Resistance is possible. Independence is achievable. The story ends not with summary, but with discovery. In 2024, researchers excavating near former Porter camp in Tanzania uncover mass grave. 173 bodies, no identification, no grave goods, just bones arranged in rough trenches. Carbon dating places deaths in 1918 to 1919 timeframe. Skeletal analysis shows malnutrition, disease, healed fractures consistent with heavy labor. Teeth show wear patterns from carrying loads balanced with forehead straps. DNA analysis is ongoing. Perhaps some of these men can be returned to their families. Perhaps their names can be recovered from fragmentary records. Perhaps they can finally be properly commemorated. Or perhaps they remain anonymous like so many thousands. Either way, the grave proves what the records concealed. The scale of death, the mass disposal of bodies, the erasure of human beings reduced to statistical casualties in someone else's war. The ground holds truth when paper lies. Who cares about native carriers? We do, because their story is not footnote, their sacrifice is not trivial. Their deaths matter. The African porters of the East African Campaign carried more than supplies. They carried the weight of empire's ambitions. They paid the price for Europe's conflicts. They died in numbers that dwarf official tallies. They returned home to betrayal. They received paper money that turned worthless. They watched promises evaporate. They buried children and elders killed by pandemic they brought home. They rebuilt communities devastated by their absence. They passed down understanding that empires are vulnerable. They planted seeds that grew into independence movements. Their legacy is not just suffering, it is survival. It is resistance. It is the beginning of the end of colonial rule in Africa. The porters mattered then. They matter now. Remember them.